Hey, this is going to be part 3. So first of all, this is a lot of content to cover. I'm going to try to do it in one video, but it doesn't mean that you have to sit down and watch the video in one sitting. Okay, take what you can hack for a day and then come back for the rest a little bit later, break it down here and try to get through it eventually. It doesn't have to be in one sitting. So let's just make sure that you can know that. Okay, you guys have gone ahead and read The French Monarchy Faced a Crisis, chapter 21.1 on page 482. If you haven't done that, go ahead and read that for a better background of what we're about to talk about. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and look at The French Monarchy Faced a Crisis and what we have in here. So, what we want to first of all look at is the structure of the French society. This was known as the Old Regime, and the Old Regime really was part of the oldest days of French feudalism. It was a structure, an establishment of society broken into essentially 3 classes of people. And you can call them estates, and we can call them the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. So nothing too complex there. Now let's discuss each, okay? So the first we have the clergy. This is the first estate. The first estate was made up of bishops and abbots, okay, parish priests, and the Catholic Church. And by the way, this is France. We're talking in a Catholic context. Their national religion was imposed upon to be Catholicism, and they were a powerful country that tried to work hand in hand with, church and state sort of thing, where there was an emphasis on everybody being Catholic and united under one religion. So religion did play a huge political role and had a lot of political influence here. Now, in this sense, you have the first estate being their own class of people, the people who made up the clergy or the priests and leaders and whatnot within the church. Okay, so they held 10% of the land in France, as we've talked about. The bishops and abbots were very wealthy, mainly because they had access to land, which land produces wealth. Common parish priests were often, though, as poor as the people who they served. They just lived in little villages and provided the pastoral or religious needs and services to the people that they served. All of the clergy paid no direct taxes to the government. However, they did give a 2% honorary gift to the government annually. It wasn't obligatory, but it wasn't a tax, but they did still contribute a little bit financially to the running of the government. But for the most part, they were exempt from taxes, and they enjoyed, especially the wealthy ones, the more high up in their leadership and whatnot within the church, enjoyed a very comfortable life. Okay, that's the first estate, the clergy. Now, the second estate were the nobility, the French nobility. Now, they actually make up 1.5 to 2% of the whole population of France. So it's a very small number of people who make up a large piece of the influence and power within France. They own 20% or to 25% of the land, as we see when we look at different estimates of this. But that's a huge piece of France chunked out for a very few number of people. As we said before, land makes money and makes wealth. So the second estate are the ones who hold all the high offices in the country. They advise the king. They do stuff like that, and they don't pay any tax. So that's what our second estate's up to, right? Now, our third estate can be called the commoners, the common people, the third estate, whatever. They're the largest estate. They made up 98% of the population. So basically everyone, and they were made up of actually 3 groups of people. There were 3 classes within the third estate itself, really, the bourgeoisie, which actually had the most at stake here because they were as wealthy or wealthier than a lot of the nobility, and yet they could not advance to a different estate. So they probably were really, really resentful. A lot of them were just as well educated and just as wealthy, but they just didn't have the influence because they weren't in the second estate. That made them angry. They couldn't hold those positions of power or influence or offices within France. Okay, they were highly trained professionals, people like lawyers, doctors, and such like that. So they could have been people of high status, but they couldn't be because they were in the third estate. The second were the urban lower classes. These were your tradesmen and such. A lot of them lived in urban centers, tanners, butchers, etc. Okay, now they had a comfortable life in the sense that they had a career, a profession, some sort of trade, and that type of thing. However, they didn't have the wealth or ability to go ahead and advance their social class. Okay, the third were probably the lowest end. They were the peasant farmers. They lived in the countryside generally, and they're the ones who worked hard farming the land. Okay, food production, and that it's interesting that you have a huge percentage of your population devoted to food production, and very few people who don't contribute to that industry and just reap the benefits of it. Of course, the peasant farmers were the poorest, had the worst lives in France, but I like how your text points out that they were still peasant standards in Europe at the time. French peasant, you'd probably prefer to be a French peasant than any other peasant. They still had it pretty good. But that's the third estate. Now, they paid all of the taxes. The taxation was paid by the third estate. And they even owed free labor every year to help the king, construct and maintain roads and bridges and things like that. And they had to pay the tithe to the church. In other words, the money they would donate to the services and operation of the church and the ministries of the church, and the wages and salaries or whatever of the priests and whatnot. So a heavy financial burden was placed upon the third estate. I think it even says up to half of their income was in taxation somehow, which is incredible in the sense that the most wealthy aren't paying anything near that, whereas the most needy, the third estate, kind of are. That burden is really on them to finance the country. Okay. Now, this is an interesting cartoon. It shows the peasant, or the third estate man, and upon his back ride the clergy and the nobility. And this is really a depiction or a symbol of France at the time, where the success and comfort of the top two estates is all because of the kind of expense and labor and at the exploitation of the third estate. The pie chart gives similar data to our text, but it kind of just structures it out visually a little bit different. So here you show the proportion of population, 0.5% to the first estate, 1.5% to the second, and then the rest, 98% to the third. Then you see land ownership and the misproportionality within here too. Okay, so you see that it's really, really, really bad in terms of what land does the church own. Now, in all fairness, by the way, a lot of this land was acquired by the church through the goodwill and donation of people. And so people are giving that land and entrusting it to the church over the centuries. So it is built up over the centuries, and now becomes at the stewardship of the clergy, which can profit highly off of it. Okay, bishops and whatnot. And then finally, taxation shows that 100% of taxation was to the common people, the third estate. And as we already said, that's going to be an obvious sign of discontent in French society at the time. Now, normally I go ahead and do a simulation of an estate's activity. I can't do that because I don't have people here to be my little pawns in the simulation. But try to envision it with me briefly here. We'll go ahead and look at this. Normally we're going to look at this pie chart here, and then we would take a student ratio within the room and a desk ratio and try to get our population to land ownership ratio figured out, and simulate a couple other things. But let's just do this, for instance. Let's imagine 100 people in a room. So if there's 100 people in a room, 98 of them would be the common people. Okay, obviously. Now 1.5 of them would be part of the nobility, and only half of one of those guys would be part of the clergy. Okay, now let's say we have 100 tiles on the floor. Okay, 100 tiles on the floor. 98 of the people in the room would have to claim only 65 tiles on the floor. And 1.5, or the second estate, so 1.5 people would then get the comfort of having 1/4 of that room. So 25 tiles on the floor belong to only 1.5 people. So you see the density of person to a tile is really high here, but not so high here. And then lastly, you have half a person enjoying 10 tiles, 10% of the whole room, okay, divided into 10 tiles of the whole room are to half a guy, okay? And then I go around and I collect some taxation. But guess what? I go to the most wealthy people, the nobility. You guys, you guys are exempt from taxation. But then I go to the clergy and I say, oh, you guys are exempt from taxation. And then I come to that crowded third estate parcel of land and I say, hey guys, I need taxation. And guess who pays the tax? Those guys. They do. Okay. So another thing kind of neat to look at is a couple things. We already mentioned taxation. So 100% of the taxation is paid by the commoners. They pay the tax. It sucks to be them. You can see their resentment building up. Okay. Clergy and nobility, they don't pay the tax. Okay. Now, what about building a road? So I have to go every year. The roads need to be maintained. Well, who's maintaining the roads? Who uses the roads? Well, these guys do. They're the ones who have the wealth to travel. But guess what? These guys are the ones who actually build the roads and maintain them and whatnot. Okay. And last but not least, I like this idea of eating a meal because what kind of comfort level do you have when you're eating? Now, I'm not the greatest cook myself, but let's imagine, this amazing plate, this feast. You got all sorts of foods and tastes there. Now, that might be something enjoyed by our good friends, the clergy, the bishops, always having a nice full plate of food. And I like that stereotype of a bishop having a nice full round belly. Well, that's there for a reason. Okay, and then you have another full plate of food. Put that one this way. And that might be enjoyed by somebody like the nobility. Okay, a nice plate of food. It actually doesn't look that good in picture, but I'm sure it would be great steaming on your plate. Nobility, get to eat a nice big hearty meal. And what do you think the main food staple for our buddies, the commoners, is? Any guesses? I would guess a chunky, hard, charred baguette or a piece of bread. Lovely diet, a lot of corn and grain and whatever. Okay. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about the bread riots and the food shortages. And it's kind of interesting that today, we still have dependency upon our grain storage at this time. So that people can make bread. So, I mean, if you can even just use grain to make bread, that's a first point of survival if you're trying to feed yourself. Okay, especially during a shortage or economic upheaval like we're going through right now, access to grain is pretty high demand. Okay, let's take a look at our monarchy at the time. Our monarchs at the time is King Louis again, but not King Louis XIV from the last video. It's King Louis XVI, actually. So I like to introduce him and say, don't get the V and the I mixed up. Okay, this guy's the 16th. He comes after, 2 Louis after, I would presume. And Louis the 16th, okay, is a completely different story than Louis the 14th. And his wife, Marie Antoinette, they were married very young, probably some arranged marriage between the French and Austrian monarchies. She was very not popular in France because she lived her extravagant court lifestyle at a time where the French banks or whatever, the royal banks were empty anyways, and she's still living this lavish lifestyle while the rest of her people are suffering. So there's this sense of obliviousness that Marie Antoinette actually has to the people that she married into rule with Louis the 16th. And I like 2 questions here. And the one common question, of course, is why does the French Revolution start? But I think you can start picking up on some of those reasons already. And the second question is, how does France go from this guy to this guy? How is it that France goes from Louis the 14th to Louis the 16th, the pinnacle height and absolute rulership of a king, to kind of the epitome of patheticness, and we'll see what happens to him type of king? How does it happen? So keep that in the back of your mind, how you go from the best king of history, French history, to potentially the worst king of French history in less than 100 years. Okay? So let's start looking at some of those reasons as we look at the reasons here of the French Revolution. So the first one of them to consider, a first to consider, would be Louis himself. He was good-hearted and generous, but he was not a strong leader. He was indecisive and allowed matters to drift. And it was his the way he dealt with issues and his indecisivity and lag time between reacting to an issue that actually led to his downfall. So a poor leader himself. All right. Second, France was in deep debt. We already mentioned, and the royal court's still living its lavish lifestyle, but they're in deep debt. Why? Because they saw an opportunity to actually help the Americans from last unit fight the British. And the Americans win their independence at a cost to France, who helped them, who actually borrowed money to do so. So they're suffering still in debt. When you're in debt, it's not a good thing. It really stifles kind of your economy and leads to all sorts of bad things, which is what we're actually concerned about today in our time, is that our economy is kind of at a standstill in a lot of ways. That's not good. We're going into debt, with the expense of, EI and assisting people through this time and whatnot. And our economy isn't really making up for those expenses. So there's debt happening right now too. Keep that in mind. But in any case, that's an issue that launches this dissatisfaction of people, is that there is not enough money to go around to run the country. Okay? The taxes being collected aren't helping. And by the way, who's paying all those taxes? Keep that in mind. Another one is, because of this issue of money, Louis hopes to actually gather taxes from the nobility. Because here's the solution. They're not paying tax right now, but they have the most capacity to do so. So his idea is, let's tax the nobility, but actually the nobility refuse to pay the taxes unless he opens or calls together what's called the Estates General. So the Estates General is called, here's where you have an instance where King Louis says, okay, I will peacefully decide to accept your demand on me, the king, to open the Estates General. Whereas an absolute ruler would say, to heck with you guys, I am the law. This is the law now. You will die or go to jail if you do not pay tax, and you just don't ask the input of your people. What Louis does, here's an example of his indecisivity and his weak leadership, is he says, okay, I will, appease your demand and call the Estates General, which he does. So he says the Estates General calls them, and on May 1st, 1789, they come together. Now we have to define the Estates General. We're going to do that in the next few slides here. Okay, but what it is essentially is a different version of the English Parliament, but not exactly the same. English Parliament actually is way different from this at this point in time. By 1789, the English Parliament is well founded to being basically running its own country. Okay, whereas the French version of the Estates General was a legislative body. It helped to determine and consult with the king on matters of government. So it was a consultative body versus really a lawmaking body. What it did is it involved the different classes of French society of the old regime, so those three estates, as we'll see, and there were representatives of all the estates within the Estates General who all gave their input on the matter being discussed. Now, the problem, we already looked at this in our intro, but the problem is that the Estates General was constructed to do this. They would all meet about the issue and then separately, as an individual estate, vote for or against a given proposal. So let's take the proposal to tax the third estate. So each estate membership within the Estates General, the first, second, and third, would be given the question, should we tax the nobility? And then each would have to determine an answer and then cast that vote, either yes or no. Okay. Now, let's go to the nobility first. Should we tax the nobility? The nobility is going to say, with their one vote as a group, they're going to say no. Now, the clergy, a lot of them are, schmoozing with the nobility and come from nobility lineage and what have you. So they have concerns of the nobility in mind anyways as well. So they're going to vote no. How about you ask the question, should we tax the nobility? Of course, the common people, the third estate, is going to say, with their one vote collectively as an estate or as a group, yeah, we should tax. But guess what? At the end of the day, when you have the three votes cast, what you have is 2-1. Should we tax the nobility? The answer would be no. Does that make sense? So this is the way it was set up to vote. This is probably why the nobility have never paid taxes, because the clergy and nobility would always gang up on that question to say, no, let's tax everyone else. This is where the power is in these two groups, and it always is. Whereas this is where the representation and proportionality of the population is, yet they are kind of disadvantaged by the power that the first two estates have. Okay? Now, with Enlightenment ideals kicking around, everyone else, or the commoners, are extremely upset with this system. So they actually propose a different one more representation. The third estate says, hey, the estates general should work like this. Everyone should meet together in one room, discuss the issue at hand, and each individual representative in that estate should be able to vote individually. We will count all votes equally from each individual member. Now, what would that do? Well, that would do something very different. It would say that if you pose that same question, should we tax the nobility, the first and second estate and the members that they have within the estates general would be able to cast 591 votes to say, no, we shouldn't tax the nobility. Whereas if you ask that question and everyone else, or the commoners represented in the estates general, were able to cast their votes individually, 610 of them would be able to say, yes, we should. So in this situation, who holds the power? Everyone else. Even though still, keep in mind, proportionally, 610 is not 98% of your population versus 591. And I'm getting that from the proportion of people who actually belong to that third estate. However, it does go ahead and say, look, you have the representative power within the estates general to actually make your voice heard for once. Now, this was the demand made, and they demand that everybody did this. When they were ignored, though, now obviously the king, the first and second estate, the most powerful, would say, no, we reject that idea, because if we accept that idea, you're going to beat us. Why would you change it up in order to lose? You wouldn't. You have your own interest in mind, and you're like, no, we're going to vote the old way so that we can win, not you. Okay, does that make sense? So what happens is that idea is rejected, and then you have the third estate going berserk. So eventually, as a result of this rejection of that proposal, the third estate runs away to a room, or gathers in a room, an indoor tennis court, and they determine to call themselves a governing body called the National Assembly. They proclaim an end to the absolute monarchy and the beginning of representative government. And then later at the tennis court oath on June 20th, they vow to remain together, to not disband as a group of National Assembly until they have written a constitution. This is the first, you could say, act of rebellion by the common people. They call themselves a National Assembly. They create a legislative body that changes the government structure or type of France at the time. They vote to end the monarchy as if they have authority to do that, and they do, officially start the revolution through that act. Now, interestingly enough, is this an act of treason? Now, by the way, we go back to last unit. Charles I of England was executed for committing treason against his parliament and not following the wishes of his parliament. He was executed for treason for that. The Americans, when they declared the Declaration of Independence, the British react to that as treason right away, and they're on it, and they fight a war on it. What about this one? Here you have the third estate doing this treasonous act, or is it? I mean, you can determine whether. I think it's treason, obviously. Okay, they're saying we have authority and we declare this, when they have no authority, legislatively speaking, other than the one they declared for themselves out of thin air. And so the National Assembly, in the meantime, had, as a revolutionary body, had been locked out of the Estates General and not permitted back in. In reaction to that perception of being locked out, they go ahead and vow the tennis court oath, as we said. And in response, the king eventually does order. He says, oh, here's the situation. How am I going to deal with it? And he says, let's all meet together. Okay, we will pay heed to the considerations of the third estate. But in the meantime, he sends mercenary Swiss guards to Paris, which is actually where the States General is meeting, in Paris. And we end up having the situation called the storming of the Bastille. He sends his mercenary Swiss troops because he can't actually trust his French ones. And in reaction to this, you have a sudden Paris mob, which tends to be the following story for the rest of the French Revolution. And the Parisian mobs lead what's called the storming or the fall of the Bastille. Now, what's the Bastille? You can see in the pictures here. I mean, it actually doesn't exist today. It was torn down um, because of the actions of the French Revolution, I believe. It doesn't exist today as this building, but these paintings depict this kind of fortified castle in Paris. It's an old fortress. It was used as a garrison. It's a place to store weaponry and whatnot, and is a prison for political prisoners and stuff like that. In fact, back in time, Voltaire from the Enlightenment unit was imprisoned there for some time for his ideas. Okay, now the mob uh, did go ahead tear down and break into and kill the guards and whatever, who valiantly fought to the death uh, to kind of keep control of the Bastille. And they lost their lives. And here's where the mob gets bloody and savage right away. So they go and start marching the heads of these guys on pikes who they've just killed to take over this Bastille. Now, inside the Bastille, you might be like, oh, okay, then they freed everybody inside because of their Enlightenment ideas of liberation. Well, there were a couple insane guys in there, and there's only 7 prisoners inside, so it wasn't really an accomplishment of freedom or liberation. And they kill more people taking it over than they end up freeing. So it's really an act of savagery, I would say. But in any case, what they do is they do gain weaponry and gunpowder, so they're able to defend themselves. And what this action does is that it really shows the power that the commoners or the Third Estate has, or the National Assembly has, and it is the one action that keeps the National Assembly alive. Otherwise, if the Bastille would have stood, and if the Third Estate and the mob could have been put down, perhaps that National Assembly would have been put down too, but that act of treason is allowed to continue and exist. Now, most important, I think, is interesting because it becomes a symbol of the revolution. The tennis court oath, the forming of the National Assembly, the storming of the Bastille, these are things that kick off the French Revolution. This becomes a iconic symbol, a memory of the people to say, here's what we're fighting for. We're fighting against a corrupt absolute monarch. We're fighting to liberate France. And by destroying the Bastille, it's kind of like a symbol of destroying the fortified, power that the king has over the common people. And to this day is celebrated as their national holiday, July 14th, equivalent in a way to Canada's July 1st. Cool. There you have, storming of the Bastille. Now, there's a couple things that happen after this. We already said that there's a bread, I don't think we said this. So there's a bread shortage and a famine happening at the time, a very harsh winter. And the cost of grain and bread is on the rise because, as we talked about supply and demand is very high and supply is very low. Now, this actually makes people who are common, depending on bread for their food staple, unable to pay for it. And so they're going, in hunger or going extremely poor, just trying to sustain themselves at this time. The economy of France is really in a pathetic situation at this time. So the people are really, really angry. And they're also motivated and compelled by the power that the Third Estate seems to be having with this National Assembly stuff. By October, there's this incident of bread riots and this march, because of the bread riots and people are angry. The normal population, the common people are angry. By October, the Parisian women are actually brave enough to mob together and march towards Versailles, which is a couple miles out of Paris, that palace we talked about in last chapter, and to go and demand from the king and queen help to be fed. Because the king and queen, they perceive, are having this flamboyant luxury. They aren't going hungry during the time where most of France is. And what they end up doing is these women, these ladies, with pikes and whatever. I like this picture. So here's an influential point of women actually in history, where they go in, march to the king and queen, they force themselves into through the palace guards, and they kill them. They force the king and queen then to come back with them to Paris, and from that point on, the king and queen are prisoners of Paris during the French Revolution. It's at this point that it is often stated that Marie Antoinette, the queen, has said, let them eat cake when she's notified, hey, there's a bunch of crazy ladies outside rioting about food and the shortage of bread or whatever. And she's apparently utters, let them eat cake, as if in ignorant, whatever. This likely was never said, but it's not too far from imagination that it could have been by her at this point in time. In any case, these women are the ones who have power in the situation because they're able to bring the king and queen back to Paris. Okay. We have this other thing called the Great Fear, and I think this one's interesting to talk about right now. This like sense of paranoia in the countryside or through the country, because we kind of have that in a sense today with our pandemic. Not so much because of revolution and fear of, being punished for our revolutionary actions, but more for a sense of the uncertainty of the disease, but also being equipped and being supplied with right things like toilet paper or whatever needs that we might have. We're kind of mobbing and doing crazy things, buying up hand sanitizers and masks and whatever. Okay, so it's interesting. We see that mob mentality even in our situation today. So relate to that. The Great Fear is something that spreads from Paris through the countryside. It's this fear that the third estate and largely peasants have for being punished by the revolutionary actions from the much more powerful second estate, their nobility. They expected retaliation from the nobility, retaliation from the king, and they kind of were in fear for a little while, went to hiding and whatever, expecting this great, outlashing against their revolutionary actions to occur. But what actually happens is that never happens. Okay, it doesn't come. And so the French peasants and third estate, they become the ones that go out into the countryside and start terrorizing. Okay, they realize that their revolutionary power was not checked. So they're going to go out and do something, make the offensive move first then. And so that's what they do. So they go out, terrorize the countryside in mobs, pitchforks and whatever. You can see these little peasants, all these angry peasant mobs go out and rioting. And what they do is they bind together and in a pack of people with the power that they must have and like this sense of camaraderie as peasants or whatever. They go ahead and they go into their manor houses. They destroy feudal bonds. They rip up property, bonds or whatever that held them as feudal serfs to the land of their nobility and lords and whatever. They ripped up those things. They made terrifying demands of the nobility and whatever, and they become the ones who are terrorizing the country, the peasants and third estate themselves. So that's the Great Fear. And the Great Fear was initially experienced by the peasants, but then it was eventually experienced by the nobility. Okay, from the terrorist actions of the peasants. It's interesting. When you talk about terrorism today, it has a whole different context. Okay, so this is interesting because I think overall, contrary to this sense of Enlightenment ideals being this noble cause of the French Revolution, what we actually see, I think from my observation, is that much of the French Revolution is a mob reaction to something, which shows very much an emotional or very irrational action to something, other than the sense of justice and the sense of unfairness that is felt and experienced by the people there. So a couple things to think about there. All right, here's a quick little look at some of the causes of the French Revolution. Let me go through and give you some feedback on some of them. First of all, the absolute monarchy. We are looking at a time where constitutional monarchies, or even places governed like America without a monarchy at all, are happening in the world. England's a good example of this. And yet in France, you are tied to this absolute monarch who has complete and absolute control, which is not in line with the times, or so felt by the people. So that's a political reason, okay? Let's look at this one. Growth of industry and rise of the middle class. We already said that the bourgeoisie, the top tier of the third estate, or the commoners, were as wealthy or influential or industrious, I guess you should say, or more so than the nobility that made up the second estate. And yet they couldn't rise beyond their class. This sense of injustice there. Next, you have growing burden of feudal dues. The feudal dues are paid by the peasantry and the third estate. So of course you have that growing burden, especially at a time of economic suffering where taxation is needed to get out of your national debt. You have a time of growing poverty. Here's another one, increasing poverty, because you have to spend more on bread, blah, 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 blah. So it's just compounding its issues. And you can see the people who have the biggest stake of issues is the third estate, no doubt. Let's look at economic reasons. So growing government debt, talked quite a bit about that already, helping to liberate the Americans from the British and the debt that France accrued for that, as well as the continued lavish expenses of the royal court. Okay. Attempt to tax the nobles. We talked about this being a solution to the problem, but it actually initiates the bigger problem of the third estate finding it having enough power to declare itself a government and blah, blah, blah. So the attempt to tax the nobles might have been a solution here. Of course, the nobles would never vote to tax themselves. And then the tax burden on the third estate was only increasing, as we already said, because of increasing debt of the country and the burden of taxes falling only on our third estate and our commoners, right? Okay, let's look at these last two. The growth of new ideas. Everyone is born equal, for instance. The idea that if you have an unjust ruler, you have the right to rebel until you actually are, as a collective society, happy with who's ruling you and the liberties that you're willing to compromise in order to live in a society. But the fact is that those are Enlightenment ideas, and they are taking hold in France and actually undermining the traditional way that France is structured. And then finally, the influence of America. Who wouldn't think that America had no influence on this? They had just defeated the most powerful country in the world and declared their own independence, and have successfully, for a number of years by this point, have been operating as a country in the world independent of any monarch. And that is cool. So the influence of America would have shown, hey, they can do it, so can we. Of course, them being influenced by Enlightenment ideas also. So the next thing I want to do is just watch this little clip. It gives us an idea about French society at the time. The third estate, the royal court and whatnot, is supposed to be a comedy, but it gives you the idea anyways. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of myself. Push play.
This week we're in France for a special royal edition of Historical Wife Swap. The King of France, Louis XVI, and his wife Marie Antoinette will be doing a wife swap with Mr. and Mrs. French Peasant. But how will these two extremes of the French class system get on?
Welcome to my humble abode, Mrs. Peasant. Up!
Oh, your trousers, they appear to be around your ankles.
I know! I do it all the time to make my friends laugh. Because I am your lovable, eccentric King Louis XVI. We are going to have so much fun. Benoit, you show Mrs. Peasant to her room. Oh, if you don't like it, you can pick another one. We have 700 rooms here at Versailles.
Meanwhile, over at the peasant cottage.
Which way is my room?
This is your room. And my room, it is the room.
Oh, very funny! My husband also likes to drop his trousers.
I've lost so much weight that they keep falling down. Us French peasants are starving to death.
Well, anyway, it's very funny when Louis does it.
So, are things going any better at the royal palace?
Tell me, Mrs. P, would you like some cake?
Oh, yes, please.
Benoit! Bring some cake, please! I am a lovable eccentric, no? Am I not, Benoit?
Oui, très amusant.
Oh, do you mind? Only I haven't eaten for weeks.
Be my guest.
The king just asked me if I wanted to have a bath in crushed strawberries. These royals, they are so out of touch. We peasants are starving, and they are having baths full of strawberries. I will scoff a lot. I am a starving peasant.
It's supper time at the peasant cottage.
You don't expect me to eat grass? Do you think I look like a cow?
Serious question?
But surely you peasants don't really eat grass.
Last year there was a terrible harvest, and now the price of wheat is so high we can't afford bread, so yes, Some of us have resorted to eating grass.
I must say that this whole experience has been a real eye-opener for me. I mean, the poverty, the hardships, I have learned so much. Like never hang out with peasants. Ugh.
The wife swap is at an end, and it's time for the royals and the peasants to settle their differences.
Oh! Look at that! Your trousers are around your ankles.
This country does not need a lovable eccentric for a king.
France is penniless, and yet you royals, you're spending money like it grows on trees.
Which is silly because it doesn't.
How can you bear to see your country in such a state?
Excuse me. I'm from Austria. This isn't actually my country.
It's true. I don't think you are helping.
Let's start a revolution.
Oui.
Down with the royals! Vive la révolution!
Don't worry, darling, I know exactly how to deal with this. Tick, tock, boom! Voila! Oh! Look!
I don't think it's working. Run.
Vive la révolution!
That's for me.
And so began the French Revolution. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette tried to escape the angry peasants in Paris by fleeing disguised as servants. They were arrested after a merchant recognised the king from his face on a coin. Head you lose, eh? Which, as it happens, is exactly what happened to Louis. What? Oh, we got his head chopped off. It's a joke. Suit yourself.
Okay, little spoiler alert at the end of that video, but it gives you a little bit of context as to what's up with our next chapter. Anyways, we're at the point of the end of the chapter. Here's some of the concepts that are things you should be able to identify. So go ahead and take a bit of time to consider and work on the section review on page 487. Come back and we will review them together. So let's go ahead and look at our section review of the French monarchy faced a crisis. Okay, let's define estates. The estates were the French social classes. How many were there? 3. It's like Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, where I wait for your answer, and then I verify that you got it right in your head, even though I have no idea if you got it right or not. Okay, July 14th, 1789 is significant because it was the date of the fall of the Bastille, which we talked about at length. What about the Bastille? The Bastille was a fortress in Paris, used in the 1700s as a jail for political prisoners. It was a garrison during the time that it was stormed as well. It had some prisoners as well. But it fell and became a great symbol of the French Revolution. Louis XVI was the king at the time of the French Revolution. You could look at some of his characteristics, namely him being a poor leader and indecisive, and running a country in complete debt. The old regime was France's social society, which consisted of the absolute monarch and feudalism and the 3 estates. The old regime led by the king, the 3rd estate at the lower end. Then you have the 2nd and 1st estates, which we'll talk about here. The Estates General was the lawmaking body of France. It hadn't been called for 100 and something years, so it wasn't necessary to the legal functioning of France, it seems to me. And it certainly didn't have as much power as its British equivalent, which would have been Parliament and the nobility and House of Commons, whatever, that would have had power in England at the time. But it was called the Estates General because it was made up of the 3 estates, or at least membership of the 3 estates. The National Assembly is the assembly that passed laws and reforms in the name of the French people without authority to do so. They declare themselves a National Assembly, declare themselves having authority to do this and create a constitution, and yet they never did. So interesting, National Assembly, their act kicks off the French Revolution as we know it. Interestingly enough, the National Assembly is also the name of French lawmaking bodies today. The provincial legislature of Quebec is called the National Assembly. So I wonder why that is. I don't know, but I think it's kind of interesting. Okay, number 1. Questions. What were the 3 estates in France? There were 3. The first, which were made up of the clergy, the second, made up of the nobility, and the third, which were made up of the bourgeoisie, the urban lower classes, and the peasant farmers. All right. What part did each play in French society and government? There's much more to add than what I'm sharing here, but let's take a look. The first estate had 10% of the land and, would we say, 0.5% of the population. A lot of them may have been poor parish priests, but some of them would have been very rich, wealthy bishops and abbots of monasteries and whatnot. Okay. The second estate were the nobility. As we said, they hold the high offices in church and government, and in the royal courts, they have the ones of powerful positions. And then the third estate were the ones who supplied labor and taxation and blah, 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 blah. Now, what are the groups that made up the third estate? Let's look at that more in detail. What do you think? Well, the bourgeoisie, they were the well-educated professionals, prosperous merchants. They had often as much wealth and education or more than their nobility neighbors, yet they were not part of the second estate. The manual laborers or the urban lower classes were the urban and rural peasantry, actually the peasant farmers, and the urban lower classes were the peasantry, so they were the poor people. The urban manual laborers or tradesmen were more well off than the rural agricultural farmer peasantry, but really they didn't have education or wealth the same way that the bourgeoisie did, and they even dressed differently, as your textbook will tell you. Now, why would each be dissatisfied with the old regime? I've pointed out this a little bit, but the bourgeoisie certainly were as rich as the nobles, and they would have been looking at this as unfairness, saying, look, if it's a status of wealth and prestige and education, then why aren't we part of the second estate? That's why they would be upset. Yet the law treats them as peasants, as the third estate. So that seems unfair. What about the others? Well, the poor people could not depend on a steady diet. The peasants had to pay all the high taxes. And so you have the uncertainty of life just in poverty and basically the dependence upon the comfortable life of the very few elite French people on the backs of the peasants, as we saw in that cartoon earlier in the slide. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction of the peasantry, bread shortage, taxation, the way the Estates General worked, okay, that made them a little bit upset for sure. What was the voting system in the Estates General before 1789? Well, the voting system was that each estate collectively had one vote per estate. They'd all have to contribute one vote. So in essence, there were 3 possible votes to cast, one from each estate. And the first and second could always outvote the third, which is why the third was always hooped and why the third had no advantages in French society. How did the third estate wish to change this system? We reviewed this. What they wanted to do is that all members should be able to contribute one vote equally, individually. And in doing so, the third estate, who had most members in the Estates General, would actually be able to hold more power than in the first situation up here. How did Louis react? Well, he orders the estates to follow the old rules, after which the third estate creates the National Assembly, tennis court oath, storming the Bastille, French Revolution. Let's look at the Great Fear. What happened during the Great Fear? Well, during the Great Fear, the peasants banded together, broke into the noble manors' homes, tore legal papers binding them to pay feudal dues. They burned the houses, essentially severing their ties or their bound ties or slavery. It's not slavery, but their ties to the nobility to whom they served or farmed or whatever. So the Great Fear did that, where you have peasants terrorizing the countryside. Now, at first, Louis the 16th called the fall of the Bastille a revolt, but he was told it was a revolution. What is the difference? This is more of a kind of a terminology thinking word. Is a revolt and revolution different? Revolt versus a revolution. And so what would you think about that? Okay, well, a revolt suggests maybe a short-term disruption. A one-time incident is a revolt that you can put down and then move on. But this idea of revolution suggests permanent change. It's not going to stop turning until something's been satisfied there. And at this point, we see a chain reaction of things happening that's showing that this is not just one isolated revolt. This is active revolt with active revolt, another active revolt. It's forming something bigger, a revolution, which is why we call this the French Revolution. Okay, that is our look at the first chapter of the French Revolution. We're going to be looking at the second section here, Revolution Brought Reform and Terror, in the next video. In the meantime, DBL and take care.